here at the Watchmaker's Workshop for another Q&A episode where you get to ask me questions about anything watchmaking related, and I'll give my best answer. We got some interesting questions this time, and a lot of them actually had to do with jewels, watch jewels. There seems to be a lot of fascination around what they do, how they're made, and almost as if they're kind of mysterious within the watch. So maybe we'll be able to shed some light on those jewels. If jewels are very hard sapphire, why don't the wheel axles wear out? That's a very good question. And the parts that wear out, it's actually a little counterintuitive. When you have something really hard, such as a jewel that is made from sapphire, the sapphire being almost as hard as a diamond, you might think that the sapphire would actually hurt or damage the softer axles that are moving inside of that sapphire. But the opposite is true. If a watch is used for a long time without cleaning it and re-oiling it, the softer material of the wheel axle will actually start to become impregnated with other materials that will cause almost like a polishing paste to form. And the axle will become abrasive because small bits of hard material will grind into the outside of the axle, and the dirty oils that are on that axle will actually create a polishing compound, something abrasive. And this abrasive axle turning inside of that sapphire jewel will actually wear out the jewel. So both parts will be damaged or somewhat unusable afterward, but you will see a lot more damage on the jewel than you will on the axle. And this is what happens between steel parts and brass parts that rub together. The brass is softer and will become abrasive, eventually polishing down the steel, which is harder. So the harder material doesn't always damage the softer material. Ideally, if those parts are cleaned and oiled regularly, neither of them will wear out. How are the tiny jewels made? As far as I know, the small sapphire jewels that are used in watches are made in a series of grinding processes. Now that's the manufacturing of the jewel from the raw material. But first, the sapphire itself has to be grown. It's grown in a lab, similar to a lab-grown diamond. So these are not sapphires that are found naturally occurring. They are grown, they are cut, and then they are ground into the final shape. So for a watch jewel, that could be many different shapes, but the typical watch jewel will have a ground outer diameter. It will be a short cylindrical shape, and it will have a hole through the center, along with some sort of ground oil sink on one side. Now, what's very important is the diameter of that hole that goes through the jewel, and also the outer diameter. The hole that goes through the jewel holds the pivot, and so it must be very precisely made to hold a certain pivot size without being too tight or too loose. Then the outer diameter is also a very specific size so that it can be press fit into a watch bridge. The grinding process is something that can only be done with diamond impregnated tools. So using different grinding wheels to grind the surfaces, and then to get the tiny little hole that goes through the jewel, there's actually a thread that is fed through the hole in order to slowly open up the hole to the proper diameter. So first a hole must be cut, and then it will be enlarged to the exact diameter that the drawings or the part requirement for that particular jewel specify. Now that string or wire is impregnated with diamond dust, diamond particles that are hard enough to actually wear away the sapphire and enlarge that hole. You mentioned before, to become a watchmaker, one of the first things you have to do is become a tool maker. What tools should we be learning to make? Figuring out what tools to make is usually dependent on the task you're trying to perform. In watchmaking, we make a lot of special screwdrivers. We modify a lot of tools such as tweezers for specific tasks. We will also make different tools for holding small components. They could either be fixtures or they could be tools like pin vices, something that is a little more universal. Being able to identify when making a tool is required in order to do the task you're trying to do, that's the biggest challenge. Knowing that if I spend 3 hours making this tool, it will save me potentially 5 hours of remaking that part, because without that certain tool, I will just scratch that part as I'm trying to finish it or assemble it. That's the first step of becoming a good watchmaker. When in watchmaking school, what areas or subjects did you find most difficult? I think watchmaking school does a very good job of weeding out people that really shouldn't be in watchmaking school. And so I never really felt like there was anything that was particularly hard in watchmaking school. Everything could be done. It just took patience. Figuring out how to not get upset with yourself if you fail at something is probably the biggest challenge. Not getting frustrated when a part you've been trying to make for 2 days snaps in two when you're trying to finish it on the lathe. That's the challenge that most people face in watchmaking school. Being able to work through that and still focus on making the best watches or doing the best repair work that you can do. You clearly have a passion for watches. Do you have a personal watch collection? And do you repair or service watches as a pastime or hobby for yourself or others? I do have a personal watch collection, and over the years it has morphed many times. I don't do so much repair work or restoration work for others. I kind of reserve that just for my own personal collection. And every once in a while, if a friend happens to have a vintage watch that I'm interested in taking apart or working on, I will usually accept that work and do that for free or next to nothing, just because I want to take that watch apart and see what's happening inside. This question is like nails on a chalkboard for a watchmaker. But it's a good question. If you could have only one aspect perfect every time, either accuracy, visual perfection, or tactile feel, which would you choose? And that's really tough because in watchmaking, we're always trying to get perfection for all of those things. So to even think about letting two of those things slip is just like nails on a chalkboard for me. But I will say, on personal watches that I restore, one thing that doesn't bother me as much with an older watch is accuracy. So I would say if I had to let something slide, it would be accuracy first, and then probably tactile feel next. So as long as visually everything was flawless, I think I would survive. Are there any other brands you wish you could have worked for other than AP and Vacheron? So if it meant I would have to switch either Vacheron or AP for another brand, I wouldn't do that. But if I could choose to work for another brand on top of Vacheron and AP, then I definitely feel like I would have been happy to work for Patek Philippe to learn even more about complex watches and see their manufacturing facility and learn from some of their watchmakers. I got 2 out of 3 of the old guard independent, very high-end watchmakers in Switzerland, and Patek would have been like the icing on the cake to work for them for a little while as well. What parts of your watches do you build in-house? In this workshop, I can make almost any part of a watch. The things that we don't make here are springs, any kind of wire spring at least. So like hairsprings and mainsprings. And also no sapphires. So the sapphire crystal that goes onto a watch case or watch jewels. I also no longer do any paint in-house. I used to paint the dials by hand, and as a watchmaker, it's a very messy job that I didn't really enjoy, so I no longer do that here in-house. Now, just because I can make almost all the parts of a mechanical watch in this workshop doesn't mean that every single watch that we make is full of all the parts that we make in this workshop. It depends on the model. The Caliber 1003 is a movement where we make almost all of the parts, including bridges, screws, pinions, wheels, main plates, cases, crowns, all of those components in this workshop. But there are other parts in other watches that come from Switzerland and other workshops outside of our Nashville workshop. Now, even though we have the equipment here to make almost all the parts in a mechanical watch, we don't. And that's because if everything in all of our watches was made in this workshop, our prices would have to be substantially higher. And as a watchmaker, I want to see more people choosing mechanical watches instead of foregoing watches altogether or buying a quartz watch. I think there's value in making sure that there are still attainable mechanical watches available. So utilizing a mix of larger volume production parts from Swiss companies paired with parts we make here in the workshop allows us to make the best watch possible at an attainable price. So I don't necessarily want to make every part here in this workshop for every watch, because then we wouldn't have any attainable mechanical watches available. It's always interesting seeing what kind of questions people come up with. So this won't be our last Q&A episode. Stay tuned and make sure you subscribe on YouTube so that next time we have a Q&A episode, you'll be able to ask some questions and get some answers.